Here's something that's really ironic. It's week 2 of visiting and remembering, right? And so I'm doing the message from where? My own home, my own office, in fact. So it is kind of like the opposite of visitation. But it's great to be able to be home and to talk to you from my own home as I get ready, in fact, to leave tomorrow to do some visitation. Last week when we talked about visiting and remembering, the message could be summarized in 2 words. God visits. It's tempting then to jump very quickly to what seems like the logical conclusion or what should be the next step in that progression. Because God visits, you also should visit. But that is not the biblical progression, and that's not the week 2 message. Today's message is one that can be summarized in 4 words. God visits through you. Scripture I want you to take a look at with me is in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 20. The Apostle Paul describes God's visitation through us in this way. He says, "We are therefore Christ's ambassadors," as though God were making his appeal through us. "We implore you, on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God." As ambassadors, what that means is that when we visit someone, we don't bring our own care or our own eyes or our own touch. We bring God's care, God's eyes, God's hands, God's touch, and most specifically of all, God's ways, not our own. That's what makes it a visit from God. There's a song that I've heard before that says, "We are his hands." And the truth is actually kind of the opposite of that. It's not that we are his hands. It's that our hands are his. He expects us, in fact, to surrender our hands to him for his use, our eyes to be able to see through us and to be able to serve as his ambassadors when we visit people to which he commands us to go. That's what the message is about today. So I want to start with this basic idea. Just because we visit someone doesn't mean that we are accomplishing the work of mercy of visiting and remembering. Just because we visit someone doesn't mean that it is automatically a Christian visit or a visit from God, and it certainly doesn't mean that everything we say or do is inspired by God because we show up with the intention of representing him. In fact, Moses learned that the hard way. Last week you'll recall that we talked about Moses' call from God to visit the Israelites. But today I want to talk about a scripture that's actually earlier than that, which is from Acts 7:23 through 29. It is a story about when Moses was a lot younger. And you may remember that he visited the Israelites and he tried to deliver them himself. This is what Acts 7:23 through 29 teaches us. It says, when Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his fellow Israelites. Notice, he decided. He saw one of them. These are key words to take note of. Who's visiting? Who's making the decision? Who's seeing? He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian, so he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. Moses thought, do you get the idea of who the actor here is? Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. The next day, Moses came upon 2 Israelites who were fighting, and he tried to reconcile them by saying, "Men, you are brothers. Why do you want to hurt each other?" But the man who was mistreating the other pushed Moses aside and said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us?" You almost hear God's echo in that voice, right? "Do you want to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" When Moses heard this, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner and had 2 sons. So when we go, we make a conscious decision that it is no longer we who are going for our purposes to see with our own eyes and judge with our own mind, but rather we go as his ambassador. We're sharing his message, not our own message. And because we are continually making good on God's pledge to visit those that God seeks and deeply loves, and we're going to do it in God's ways, that means that our ambassadorship is going to take us very regularly to visit people that we do not know and often do not like. The prophet Jonah, I think, is most known as the paradigmatic example in this regard, but in his visit to the Ninevites, obviously that's very much the case of being sent to someone that he hated to do God's ambassadorship. But really the whole Bible is full of stories like that. I want you to think, in fact, about Acts 10, 27 through 29, because that is the story of the Apostle Peter's visit to the Roman Cornelius, and it is a great example of Peter showing up as an ambassador and not even being clear about his own understanding of what it is that he's doing there. And this is when God first took the gospel to the Gentiles. It turns out that the Gentiles knew a lot better than Peter did what he was doing there. This is the story. Talking with him, Peter went inside and found a large gathering of people. And he said to them, "You are well aware that it is against our law for a Jew to associate with a Gentile or to visit him. But God has shown me," again, notice the difference between this and the prior story about who the actor is. "God has shown me that I should not call any man impure or unclean. So when I was sent for, I came without raising any objection." Here's the key verse, Acts 29. "May I ask why you sent for me?" Oh, that is great. It is fascinating to me that Cornelius, who is the one being visited, actually knows more about why Peter is there, than Peter does, and Peter is the one doing the visitation. That is so God. You know, God has heard Cornelius's prayer. So the message here is that when you are following God's direction to be God's ambassador, that there are times that it's appropriate to ask the person who you are visiting what you're doing there, because you may be an answer to a prayer that they've been praying to God about which you are entirely unaware. Note something else, by the way, that's really significant about the way that God looks at this issue of visitation. God visiting through you. When this visit that I just described, Peter's visit to Cornelius, is described later in Acts by Jesus' brother James, the interesting thing that you'll see is that James doesn't describe it as Peter's visit to Cornelius. He describes it as God's visit to the Gentiles. That's how you know God is visiting through you, is when it's described as God's visit, not your visit. So this is what James says. It says, "And all the assembly fell silent, and they listened to Barnabas and Paul as they related what signs and wonders that God had done through them among the Gentiles. After they finished speaking, James replied, 'Brothers, listen to me. Simeon has related how God first visited the Gentiles to take from them a people for his name. So God continues to visit. He visits orphans and widows in their distress, and he often sends you as his ambassador. He sends as ambassadors those he has redeemed from their distress." James says that that's one of the two hallmarks of authentic religion. In fact, he says in James 1:27, "Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows," that's a visitation, "and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world," which puts you in position to serve as God's ambassador. Biblically, the word orphan, by the way, is really broadly defined throughout the Bible. The Greek orphanos certainly refers to those who do not have an earthly parent, but Jesus uses the word to describe those who do not have an earthly teacher or mentor or guide. He uses it that way in a very critical moment, which is the night before his death, as he is talking to his disciples. And he promises them ongoing visitation. This is what he says. He says, "I will not leave you as orphans, as those without a teacher. I will come to you." Promises visitation. That's John 14:18. When prisoners are beyond our reach, that is to say, when God is not, when as ambassadors we are limited in our ability to be sent by God to visit the prisoner, then Hebrews 13:3 reminds us that he calls on us, even in the absence of being able to pay the physical visit, that we are to change the way that we think and to change the way that we live so that we never forget, not even for a moment, what they're experiencing. Hebrews 13:3 says this, "Remember the prisoners as if chained with them," meaning as if you are there visiting them, as if you are a fellow prisoner, those who are mistreated, since you yourselves are in the body also. So even when you can't go to visit, you still carry out the act, the orientation of visiting in your own home. God is still visiting through you. I am receiving an email visitation even as we speak. That's the great thing about doing this in your own office. Anyway, Scripture portrays God as always making good on his promise to visit. God never forgets. He pledges to visit the widow and the orphan in their distress, and he never forgets. He visits through his messengers at present. That's the message today. God visits through you. But this is temporary. Do you remember we talked in a previous message that we said that God sends, Christ sends his messengers to those places where he is about to go? Same thing here. When God visits through you, it's not in his absence, it is in preparation for his visit, when he comes to dry every tear. The Bible affirms that he will once again visit in person. He will complete the visitation that you started in his name as his ambassador. You can see that in 1 Peter 2:12. It says, live such godly lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day that he visits us. So daily we need to be mindful that he will return. Our visitation will reach its conclusion through his presence. He will not leave us. He will not forsake us. He will visit us again. He will do that on the visited planet, right here. C.S. Lewis called it that, the visited planet. He said that our distinction in the solar system was not that we had air and water and carbon-based life forms. He said the distinction was that this is where God visited. And it is where God will visit again. That is why we affirm every week this threefold message that ends with the promise of visitation. Listen to it. Christ has died. Christ is risen. Christ will come again.
Hear the word, do the word. .w